Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Space Sustainability and Orbital Traffic Management. I'm Jeff Faust, Senior Staff Writer at Space News and host of this one-on-one conversation with Aarti Holla-Maini, Director of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. Space sustainability is of top of mind for many people in the space community in both the public and private sectors. This interest and concern is growing as the number of satellites in orbit has increased almost exponentially in the last several years, with no signs of slowing down. How can the space community ensure that space remains a sustainable and viable environment for business, exploration, and innovation while dealing with the technical and policy challenges associated with sustainability? To discuss this topic, we are pleased to have Aarti Holla-Maini, Director of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, or UNOOSA. She was appointed to the post of director in June 2023, bringing to this position over 25 years of professional experience in the space sector. She was previously Executive Vice President of Sustainability, Policy, and Impact at NorthStar Earth Space. Prior to that, she spent over 18 years as Secretary General of the Global Satellite Operators Association. And while this is billed as a one-on-one conversation, we are going to open it up for questions from you, the audience. Feel free to submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom here. And a little later on in the discussion, we will bring those in. But first of all, Aarti, thank you for joining us here. We're pleased to have you here. I thought we'd start is that a lot of people in the audience probably have heard of the Office for Outer Space Affairs, but maybe not everyone is familiar with exactly what it is and what it does. So maybe you can start with providing an overview of UNOOSA and its activities.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to speak with you. Indeed, I think that UNOOSA is the United Nations best kept secret. I must say I came here, as you said, from industry in September 2023. And when I was with the satellite operator world, I knew UNOOSA existed, I knew COPUOS existed, but I didn't really care too much. And I realize now what a gross error of judgment that was. I realize now, having come here, the impact of the office and of the committee in a way that I didn't really understand when I was on the outside. So UNOOSA was set up back in 1957 already as an ad hoc, as an expert group, a tiny expert group in New York to service what was then an ad hoc COPUOS, Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Back then, I think the committee had something like 15 members, very few member states. Today we have 104, and we're getting new applications every year. So our primary role, and the reason why the office was established, was to service this committee and support it. Over the years, the mandates have increased. We are not just a convener, where we facilitate global cooperation and shepherding the member states as they discuss space governance issues, but we're also a gateway and a capacity builder. When I say a gateway, I mean a gateway on the one hand to knowledge about space law, the space treaties and all of that, but really a gateway between all of the millions of dollars of investments that are going into space technologies, solutions, applications, and services, and member states who need them. Give you an example. We convened 27 disaster management authorities in Tonga not that long ago, and we told them about the availability of very high resolution satellite imagery, which was available to them for free, thanks to the investments of one particular space agency, Norway in that case. None of those disaster management authorities had any idea that this was available, which is shocking and which is really a poor return on investment for the investment that had been made by Norway. So in that sense, we are a gateway. We really like to inform about what is there and support member states in accessing solutions, but also we train them how to use them. And that with specific reference to Earth observation imagery, satellite data, and meanwhile, satellite imagery and its intersection with AI as well. So a short overview of what UNOOSA does.
Right. And to be clear, this is you're doing all of this in a relatively small office.
Mm-hmm. We officially we should be, I think, 33 people. In reality, we are maybe 7 short of that, something like that. So it's a tiny office, and so I'm pretty impressed by the impact that we have with the work that we do. Highly efficient.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, coming to the topic of space sustainability, what are you looking at specifically in the office in terms of fostering space sustainability among the members and working with Copios on that?
Yeah, so um, I come here from the industry, and I came here with certain knowledge about space traffic coordination and the need to enhance information sharing between operators and get them to participate more in initiatives like the Space Data Association, the EUSST, and so on. And I didn't know when I came here, not being from the UN, I didn't know, okay, how do we go from where we are today to where we need to be in terms of increasing the amount of information that is shared as a contribution towards space safety. Meanwhile, I'm learning how the UN works and how COPUOS works. And I can see that there's a certain amount of capacity building towards delegates in Vienna, which is the historical seat of space governance, as to what they need to do next. So one of the things that I did right when I started was begin that dialogue with relevant stakeholders, both industrial and governmental, to see how do we advance on that. And we organized in October last year the first UN Space Bridge, where we convened operational experts, so the flight dynamics guys from certain companies, but also from governments. I wanted to check whether what I thought needed to happen was indeed the right thing. I wanted to validate that with the operational experts around the world. So we convened like 30 representatives from 35 different states and organizations who all agreed that we know that no one national or regional system is going to be able to scale to provide a global platform where all operators, public and private, from every single country are voluntarily and proactively participating. We're going to need that platform to be born of a multilateral process. And so we came to a common understanding that, okay, we realized no national system, no regional system can be that. So what can we do to start that process at the multilateral level? We followed that up by doing 2 days of capacity building here in Vienna. We did a tabletop exercise for the diplomats. Imagine here in Vienna, the legacy home of space diplomacy. You have diplomats who have to deal with industrial development, nuclear, because we are also the seat of the IAEA, drugs and crime. Office of Disarmament Affairs has a branch here, and space. You have diplomats who know something about all of these different topics, but they're certainly not space experts. And yet they are called upon in COPUOS, in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, to deliberate and decide on topics like space traffic coordination, which are necessarily complex, necessarily technical, with a little bit of knowledge. So we wanted to enhance that and, lay the ground for the seed to be planted to move in the direction of some kind of a global platform for coordination, excuse me. And as I said, we did a tabletop exercise on collision avoidance, and we did a workshop on the fundamental elements of space situational awareness. We have the long-term sustainability guidelines, which were born of COPUOS, which talk about the need for member states to exchange information, ephemeris data, so on and so forth. If you say to a member state, you need to share your data, what reaction do you think you're going to get from them if they're not orbital dynamics people or flight dynamics people? They're going to think, what data? You want my data? Why should I share my data? This is our data. The natural instinct of diplomats who see things through a political lens is, no, I don't want to do that. So it was really important that we explained when we talk about data sharing or information sharing, what are we talking about? Explain to them, what is a conjunction assessment? How is it established? What does it look like? What does an operator do when he gets one? And what already happens? Do operators already share information between them? Yes, they do. Why? But they're competitors. Why would they share sensitive information? Explain to them, well, it's not literally A sharing with B. It's pooling into, a system which does all the maths and the calculations and algorithms or whatever, and spits out a warning if and when it's necessary. So a lot of the work that we were doing as an office was really It was capacity building, it was reassuring, informing, educating around this kind of topic. And we were successful in that the result of that process was a concrete proposal introduced at our scientific and technical subcommittee just a month and a half back to start the discussions on how to move towards a global platform for information sharing. But more broadly than that, we are looking at different aspects of space sustainability. We realize that as COPUOS has the mandate to deliberate on all of these things and to decide and to advance on them, there's a whole bunch of subjects that are not necessarily on the agenda today that may need to be going forward. For example, the environmental impact of space activities. We were approached by UNEP, that's the United Nations Environmental Program, because the member state representatives that they act as a secretariat to were jumping up and down and saying, hey, there's research going on, there are metallic particles being found in the atmosphere, there's traces in the oceans, and so on and so forth. But UNEP was very mindful of the fact that they're not the space guys, we are. So they came to us and they said, can we work on this together? So right now we're on a fact-finding mission, trying to have a baseline understanding of what research has been done, what exists, where are the gaps. That's fact-finding before anything needs to come to the committee. But just to give you another example of what we're doing in space sustainability, maybe one more. As I came to this office already in September 23, there were messages waiting for me from ICAO. Again, the aviation authorities jumping up and down because when a certain launch had taken place not that long ago, half of the Atlantic Ocean had been closed for aviation. And so there was a realization in the aviation community that the calculation of launch hazard zones, the way of doing that varies significantly between launching states. Is there a common denominator? Is there a best practice for this? Can we have a dialogue around this? Because we cannot see aviation being disrupted at that scale, especially knowing that so many more countries want to establish spaceports on their territory, which is another request that we get to support countries when helping them with their space law and policy. So different aspects of space sustainability that we're working on. There's others that I didn't mention, like ADR and on-orbit servicing as well. Part of that is supporting the market. Part of that is ensuring that the appropriate regulatory framework is around to provide certainty to the private sector and to hopefully stimulate more investment going into that. I'm glossing over lots of subjects, but hopefully.
No, that's a lot right there. And a lot of what you're describing is as you described as capacity building, as education, as doing research. At what point do you start moving beyond that and start, developing ways to actually implement space sustainability at either at international level or encouraging activities at a national level?
We've already been doing that. So since the long-term sustainability guidelines were adopted in 2019, there is a dedicated effort, also funded by specific member states, to support the implementation of the LTS guidelines. We know that, for example, if you think about the guidelines B1 to 5, which are relevant to space traffic coordination, part of that is the multilateral process. So that was what I explained about doing the UN Space Sustainability Days, the capacity building here in Vienna, convening the operational experts to validate what we thought needed to happen, and leading to the proposal, which has now been introduced formally to COPUOS. So part of it is multilateral. A lot of it is also still national. So consider last week I met a space regulator, and I asked them, I said, the suggestion in guidelines B1, 2, and 3 that member states should share or require the sharing of information about space objects and so on. Why have you not put that into the licenses that you're giving to operators? And he looked at me quite blankly and said, nobody's told us to. And I said, all right. So I'm from industry, so I'm action and results oriented. I mean, you need to do something useful. I'm very conscious of the fact that people are very ready to throw stones at COPUOS, throw stones at the LTS guidelines, at the Outer Space Treaty. Oh, this is old, this is useless, this is just paper, this is too slow, la la la. But I see, having come here from the outside world, that nobody has actually taken the regulators and the policymakers by the nose to where they need to go next. And we're trying to do that. So that's what we did with the Space Traffic Coordination Initiative. That's what we are now starting to do with this dialogue with space regulators. In that case, the space regulator said in our country, it would be the space agency who would set the policy and say, as a country, we want to see that every operator that applies for a license is sharing their maneuver plans, their ephemeris data, and so on and so forth. But nobody had ever fostered that conversation. So in our, we have an annual space law conference that will take place later this year. We're just in the process of defining the scope of these kind of conversations that we want to get going with the right stakeholders who have not been invited to have those conversations before. So that goes directly to implementing some of these, going from paper to practice. Another way that we do it is with our space law technical advisory mission. So I said we do capacity building. What does that mean? We have right now more than 65 countries who have requested to this office support with putting their space law and policy into place, and or policy. The questions are very diverse. Some countries will say, we need help in ratifying the treaties. Some countries will say, we don't have a space law. Can you help us put one in place? Some say, we want to establish a register of objects. Some say, we want to have a spaceport on our territory, and either we don't have any regulation in place, or we have some, but it's out of date. Can you help us update it? There's a whole gamut of requests, very diverse, but each one of which goes to enhancing space sustainability and really implementing at national level. I think we are not living at a time where we're going to get global consensus on a new set of binding rules. And there is a sense of urgency. You see so many space sustainability events taking place all over the world all year long. And in all of them, I mean, I go to many of them and I hear the same thing, you know, we need a new treaty, we need new rules, outer space treaty is no good, it's out of date, blah, blah, blah. From my perspective, the treaties that, yes, they're old, they are coming to life now with all the activities that are happening in a way that they never have. I just had a meeting with the government of Poland, who came to speak to us about the debris that landed on their territory. They have notified us formally, which is an obligation foreseen by the agreement on the rescue and return of astronauts. They've notified us formally of what happened and given us a whole lot of information about that. But they wanted our advice on what are their rights and obligations as they have ratified the relevant treaty and so on. But similarly, think of Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. We have governments like the US and like others who are notifying us of when they put an object in space which may have a nuclear power source on it, or when they are launching their next mission to the moon. These are all initiatives which ensure transparency and information sharing. And as we all know, that's really important for space sustainability. So we're trying to look at how do we enhance these things? How do we operationalize a lot of these things? I mean, we maintain a register of objects launched. We maintain a list of point of contacts for objects launched and for operators. We maintain a database of things which have re-entered. But what good is a database if it's not operationally relevant in some shape or form? So this is the kind of approach that we're taking to the tools that we have today to make them more relevant and enhance and increase space safety.
So much of the work you're talking about has been dealing with member states, but a lot of the activity taking place in space right now is being done by the private sector. All these mega constellations being launched by companies and the growth in launch activities in general. What is the role of the private sector at UNOOSA and these activities, given that you're dealing typically with countries and not companies?
Absolutely. So I come from industry, and they're having a hard time turning me into a UN person with the UN mindset, and I'm struggling with that too. But that's good, because right now that's a very useful perspective to have. And I understand a lot about where the satellite operators in particular come from and what their concerns are, what they like and what they dislike. But I can see hugely the value in COPUOS being a member state driven process and a decision-making process, which is really member state only. In COPUOS, in the committee, you have every single member state sitting at the same level, regardless of their size, regardless of their economic power, regardless of whether they are spacefaring or not, which means that, and they take their decisions and they do their deliberations by consensus. There's no voting per se, which means that the tiniest island state, which may not have a space agency or even a satellite, can hold up anything in the committee, right? But you see from this the value of how every member state is at the same level. And if we want a platform where all operators from every country are voluntarily participating in order to enhance information sharing, to contribute to more accurate conjunction assessments and so on, then you need to have you need to make sure that the member states who are home to all of those operators are fully bought in to whatever platform is born of that process. Yeah, and that means that the trust must be established between them. And we see that COPUOS today is a forum which is able to advance. Yeah, it's slow, but okay, diplomacy, space diplomacy takes time, and these issues are complex. Is there a way to accelerate? Sure. And that's where we come in as an office with our creativity and our side initiatives to inform and support and help the member states advance. But the private sector, in my view, it's not about giving them a seat at the table, even though we do want to work towards creating a mechanism that gives industry a sustained voice that informs the member state deliberations and discussions, right? So consider we have an action team on lunar activities right now, member state driven. I know that there are so many companies, from the most established to startups, who are engaging in lunar activities. Yeah, I want to make sure that that action team, whatever they decide are their priorities that they're going to work on, is directly informed by the priorities that are coming from industry. So we, as an office, are not going to let the member states argue with each other for however long it takes on how do we engage with industry. We, as an office, will convene industry to get their feedback, get their inputs, get their views, and synthesize that in a structured manner to inform the work of the member states. Just as I did with the United Nations Space Bridge that I convened on space traffic coordination in October last year, which was, again, getting the operational experts' inputs in order to inform the process. And that's how it has to be. I think there's a lot of noise about, oh, we need a seat at the table, industry doesn't have a seat at the table, therefore this is not the process that we want to respect and get behind. Maybe the ITU is the process we want to get behind. But as a satellite sector, we have suffered hard because of, on the spectrum front, we have lost gigahertz and gigahertz of spectrum to terrestrial sector, where terrestrial companies, telcos, mobile operators have acted as their delegations, and taken satellite spectrum away. So we have learned the lesson of what happens if you give industry a voice, and especially a paying voice at the table. That can work two ways. We don't want that to happen. There's too much at stake when it comes to space safety and sustainability to get it wrong. And we have an opportunity to get it right. So I'm all for engaging with the industry and leveraging the knowledge, expertise, and experience smartly and as and when we need it on different issues. And we're doing that. But as I said, we're also working on a mechanism to give industry a sustained voice, so that we do this systematically and multiple times throughout the year.
Yeah. Given your experience in the private sector, are there lessons learned, experiences that you want to bring in to UNOOSA to help it? And then are there things that, lessons from UNOOSA that could help the private sector, sort of a vice versa approach?
Yeah, so I think this understanding, having industry understand the value of the way COPUOS works, is one lesson that I have taken away for myself as an industry mindset person, if you will, and something that I think we should inform industry more about. And I'm trying to do that by participating in a lot more events, including industry events around the world. And I have to say, the way that we are engaging with industry right now, it's constructive, it's positive, and they understand what we're trying to achieve. They understand what I'm trying to achieve, and they're really behind it. And similarly, member states need to appreciate that we're at a time when there are so many space activities, there are so many axes at which their engagement is required, that they will only be able to deliver on their mandate if they're ready to be open to engaging and listening to the views of industry. They have to do that. We have to find a way of reforming COPUOS in the sense of enabling them to work faster and enabling them to expand the different topics on which they need to cover, given the mandate that they have. Yeah, a lot of them are already being done. Like if you followed the Summit of the Future process last year and the Pact for the Future. So this was a heads of state level event that happened, convened by the Secretary General in New York. The Pact for the Future in Action 56 is a declaration you can find online. It was formalized into a General Assembly resolution. It calls upon COPUOS to work on new mechanisms and frameworks for space traffic, space debris, and space resources. Space resources already being tackled. There has been for a few years already a working group on the legal aspects of space resources. Right now, and this is something that industry may not know, a draft set of recommendations on what are space resources, how do you define them, how should they be shared, all of these aspects has been shared with member states based on the discussions that member states have been having for the last year and a half. We need to inform industry much better about what is happening and about what we are trying to achieve and what the committee is trying to achieve on the one hand, and we need to open the member states' minds to working in a slightly different way. Diplomats have been doing this for 6 decades at COPUOS. So this system is not so open to embracing change. But when you look at the space sector, everything is changing. So therefore, if you have the mandate, you have to move with it. So there you are.
Great. You mentioned earlier working with other agencies like ICAO and the UN Environmental Organization on issues. Another international organization that comes to mind here is the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. Obviously, they have a role to play in spectrum for satellite systems, but they are increasingly showing an interest in space sustainability. How is UNOOSA working with ITU on those issues?
Yeah, thanks. So UNOOSA leads an interagency coordination mechanism called Unispace. So we convene all the UN entities and agencies and organizations who have something to do with space. We convene them around topics of relevance. So I think it was a year ago, through that process, there was a report on space debris that was published. This year, it's more on the need to harmonize the procurement of satellite imagery and data. But that is one forum where we have worked with the ITU over a few years. We also collaborate with them regularly to share the information and expertise related to our respective mandates. So, for example, we invite the ITU to participate in our space law technical advisory missions, to speak to regulators, ministries, and so on about spectrum. And this is speaking to a set of interlocutors who are not the usual stakeholders, not necessarily the telecoms regulators who sit on the ITU at the WRC and so on. And similarly, we speak at their events on space law and the treaties and policies. So there is a natural historical collaboration that is going on. There is also now, given the traction and everything that's happening, also because of the Radio Assembly resolution from 2023 in Dubai, we are now working together on capacity building. So, for example, we're defining right now a set of capacity building events which will take place both in Vienna and in Geneva. We see the need to inform our respective diplomatic communities of what's happening in both places, and that's on the life cycle of a satellite, which is basically intended to inform and educate on this is how a satellite is launched. This is where a filing comes from. This is, who are the authorities involved in giving different licenses and rights, and where do the obligations come from, blah, 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 all the way from birth to demise, if you will. We're also working to harmonize the register of space objects that UNOOSA maintains on behalf of the Secretary General, that's a treaty obligation, with the ITU's own catalogue of objects launched. So there are different avenues of collaboration that are happening right now.
All right. When we talk about space sustainability, a lot of the focus is on orbital debris mitigation, collision avoidance, and so on. You mentioned earlier that you were working with the UN Environmental Group on issues like the environmental impacts of spacecraft reentries. Are there other areas related to space sustainability that the office is looking at? One of the that comes to mind is dark and quiet skies, the effect of satellites on astronomy.
Absolutely. So there are so many areas that I lose track of them, and I didn't make any notes before this call. So dark and quiet skies is one of them indeed. This is an agenda item that came back onto the agenda of COPUOS last year. And so we have an ongoing dialogue there with the astronomer community. We will even be organizing a capacity building workshop with them later on this year. Chile is very much a champion for that, along with other countries. But yeah, that's one of the issues. We are also following very closely the activities of certain member states in trying to understand models to assess the orbital carrying capacity of the LEO orbit, for example. We are not directly involved in that work, but we do want to make sure that we contributing to enhancing knowledge and understanding around these critical issues. And when you think about carrying capacity, there are so many different angles at which you can come at this from: physical space and collision risk, the astronomical angle, the aggregate interference angle when you think about spectrum, the equity angle of access to space for all, because obviously the fundamental tenet of the Outer Space Treaty is that everybody should have access to space. Space is the province of all mankind. So these are complicated topics that we're trying to keep a handle on. I think an interesting one is active debris removal and on-orbit servicing. It's an area where you could argue that there is a market failure. You don't have operators saying, hey, can you please remove our defunct satellite, our failed satellites, and so on. Is it a governmental market, knowing that most of the legacy objects, if you look at Darren McKnight's 50 riskiest objects report, they're all governmental objects. They're not all the objects that are being launched today. Is it a governmental market that we should be looking to foster? I mean, I think that's an area where we want to have a conversation with member states to see, are there member states who, like Japan, would be willing to step up and do more technology demonstrations and perhaps remove some of their larger historical objects? Are there perhaps smaller space agencies or governments who just want to, show some leadership in this space and maybe co-invest to remove an object? I mean, we do our space law technical advisory missions where these conversations happen with so many countries, from established spacefaring ones to emerging ones, and those are extremely interesting, and we see how even the smallest nations can be very ambitious in what they want to achieve, both in terms of being space actors, establishing spaceports, having launches from their territory, but also in terms of space sustainability. But I think the other aspect of ADR and OOS is the regulatory framework. The US has been doing on-orbit servicing for many years. They haven't put any dedicated regulatory framework in place. It's done under the existing framework that exists. Is that because the host and clients have always been US entities and it's never been cross-border? Like if you think of Astroscale, the ELSA-D mission, the ADRAS-J mission, and so on, you have, Japanese company, you have cooperations with the UK Space Agency, European Space Agency, you have the launches happening from New Zealand. So you necessarily have a cross-border interplay there, which raises questions of dual use and the need to reassure and provide transparency of what exactly is happening. So you see that Japan and New Zealand are two countries who have put guidelines for a license for on-orbit servicing in place. Is that something that COPUOS may consider? If you think about what IADC did back in, was it 2006 or something, many years ago, they came up with the IADC guidelines. COPUOS looked at that and thought, well, actually, this should happen through COPUOS. This should be a global set of guidelines. So they looked at the IADC ones, they were inspired by them, and a few years later, they issued the global guidelines, space debris mitigation guidelines, which are implemented more or less everywhere. So can we do the same thing when it comes to guidelines for licenses on on-orbit servicing? Why? Not because we want to see more regulation, but because we know that this is an area where the problem is much bigger than the number of solutions which are out there. We need to see more investment, probably private, well, hopefully private and governmental, going into solutions. Maybe a regulatory framework helps. We certainly don't want the lack of a regulatory certainty to be an excuse for not seeing more investment. So I think that one needs to be very creative and thoughtful around these critical issues, and not always just see them through one political lens of this is controversial, this is dual use, it's sensitive, it goes to space security, and just keep continuing debating the problem. We need to be creative about what can we do to support solutions.
All right, great. We're getting some great questions in from the audience. I'm going to bring one here that's directly related to just what we were talking about here in terms of the regulatory environment or lack thereof when it comes to active debris removal and space servicing. But specifically, question is, how does the lack of clarity, particularly in larger spacefaring nations, affect international efforts to establish consistent policies and frameworks, and what steps can help promote greater alignment and collaboration across borders as these capabilities mature? I know you started to address some of that, but see if you had any additional thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so I think the question is, we can see areas where we can contribute, but how should we do that, right? How do you actually make that happen? You can't just, I mean, you could try convincing a member state to make a proposal to COPUOS to say, hey, these guidelines exist in a couple of countries. Let's create a working group to look at whether this can be scaled up and become global. I don't know if that's a smart way of doing it. That's one way of doing it. We have a repository of best practices for the implementation of the long-term sustainability guidelines. These are best practices. These are great examples of what happens. So what we could do is receive those, encourage the countries to submit them to us formally, make them publicly available, and do capacity building and foster conversations around them. I think a lot of what I see is not silos, but simply a lack of information flowing between governments, between government and industry, and vice versa. And I just think that having arrived here, nobody is really got these conversations going in the places where they need to happen. So consider all the space sustainability events. They're all around the world. You go to Japan, you go to Saudi Arabia, you go to the UAE, you go to the US, you go to the UK, you go to Germany. Every single place has got a space sustainability event. The decision makers with the mandates are in Vienna. They convene here. So that was one thing that I realized, that we go to these events, we enhance our knowledge and our understanding, we exchange. It's always good to talk, it's always good to communicate, but we have to be smart about this, and we have to make sure that knowledge flows to the people who are going to be deliberating and taking decisions. So I'm trying to encourage governments to do more in Vienna and work more with UNOOSA. That's also part of the motivation for us to set up some kind of a mechanism or a forum by which to give industry a sustained voice and engage with them to extract knowledge, information, and expertise for member states.
Okay. Another question coming in from the audience brings up the question of what role the office plays in sort of the long-running debates on treaties or other agreements regarding bans of weapons in space. Russia and China have, over the years, put together a variety of proposals for such binding treaties that the United States and other Western countries have opposed. Does UNISA get involved in any of those debates in any way? Have any stands or any positions on that?
Thankfully not. So we have the luxury of being Vienna, which means our mandate is space safety and sustainability. It is not space security. That is Geneva. So Paros, you have the open-ended working group, you have the group of governmental experts. These conversations around prevention of arms race in space and so on happen in Geneva. And it's tough for them. I must say, we are fortunate here that we have sort of the lighter angle of that. Our work is hard enough, but no, we don't get involved in those conversations. I think the greatest extent is when we are informed of objects being launched which may have a nuclear power source or so on. We facilitate the information sharing around it. We don't foster conversations around it. We do have a nuclear power sources working group, so there are certain structured dialogues that happen around that, but they don't go to space security aspects.
All right. A lot of the focus of this discussion has been on activities in Earth orbit. What is the office doing to look at activities beyond Earth orbit? You mentioned, I know there's this action team on lunar activities, but what is the office doing in say, cis-lunar space?
Yeah, sure. So this is a very important topic. Romania, a year ago, introduced a proposal to the committee to establish an action team precisely to look at sustainable lunar activities. That's called ATLAC. That is established, and that I mentioned that earlier. This is where member states are convening and discussing on what do we work on, where do we need guidelines, where do we need a coordination mechanism, what is it that we need. And that's where we as an office see the urgent need to make sure that industry, which is driving so many of these lunar activities, is involved. And already a year ago, we organized the first United Nations Conference on Sustainable Lunar Activities, where we brought government and industry together in Vienna. We had like 1,000 registrations for a room that had a capacity of like 400. But it's quite eye-opening when the United Nations opens its doors to industry, but very necessary. So we did that. Great consensus, even though it wasn't a formal process. Every single entity that participated, be it a space agency, be it a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, be it a private sector actor or an astronaut, everybody talked about interoperability to enhance sustainability and minimize debris and all of the other issues that could come in lunar and cislunar. This year, we are looking to convene only industry because I want to make sure that whatever ATLAC is working on is really informed by inputs from industry. So that is something that we're looking to do in June. stupidly enough, what it depends on is the availability of a room in the United Nations offices here in Vienna. But beyond that, we have already the International Committee on Global Navigation Satellite Systems, called the ICG, which is a committee that was born of COPUS, but it's been through the gestation and the birth process. It's been existing for some years. It is where all of the experts from the different existing satellite navigation systems do convene to work on interoperability and compatibility of their different systems. There is a realization at the engineer expert level that there's value in being more than the sum of the individual parts of the individual systems. But what I wanted to share with you is that the ICG has different working groups, and there is one which is specifically working on lunar time zone. So that working group is looking at coordinating with the appropriate international organizations and one of the working groups to support standardization of lunar time with traceability to UTC, so to Coordinated Universal Time. And I think this is one of the really important things. I had a call the other day with a couple of reps from lunar companies, and they said, we really need timing on the moon. And I said, yeah, but that's being worked on. Oh, really? Where? Again, I realized the lack of information that is flowing on what is happening in and around COPUS to industry and vice versa. Yeah. So I learn with every day that goes by where we as an office need to enhance and contribute and act. So it really is a constant work in progress.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that sort of challenge of coordinating information and getting that out there. What are you looking at in terms of ways to improve that, to ensure that industry knows more about what you're doing and you know more about what industry is doing, to avoid those encounters like you just described?
So I don't want to say anything yet, because right now we're still scoping and working towards establishing some kind of a mechanism that can inform and advise UNOOSA in advancing key policy objectives, whatever they may be. It might be space resources, it might, which is, could be lunar, could be mining asteroids or whatever. It could be just lunar activities. It could be space traffic coordination. It could be any number of topics. So we're trying to scope and work towards establishing something which systematically provides that kind of information and advice. I think another part is, I think we need to reverse engineer where we know what the right answer is, because we may have validated it with the right stakeholders, like we did for space traffic coordination. We convened the slingshots of the world and the space data associations and tracks and others and governmental experts as well to validate, okay, where do we need to go, what needs to happen next. I think we also need to think in terms of how do we reverse engineer to tick the boxes in process to achieve the right answer. And that will involve not only processes through COPUS, but it will also involve probably a set of activities that are facilitated by UNOOSA as an office, which contributes then to capacity building, knowledge sharing, or whatever.
All right. I'm going to go to another audience question here. Got a lot of great questions, more than we're going to be able to fit in the remaining minutes. Question here from Daniel Baker. It seems that governance of spacecraft traffic could rely on 1, industry self-regulation, 2, action by one or a few nations that are particularly active in LEO, and/or 3, UN enforcement of rules of the road. Which of these do you think has the best chance of getting the quote-unquote Wild West activity in space under control?
None. None, or certainly not the last one. There's no UN enforcement. There's no I mean, the UN does not have mechanisms or measures with which to enforce. That lies with regulators at national level. So that's why early on in this call, I had said that we don't live at a time where we can negotiate a new set of binding regulations or rules. Yes, we need companies to work together. You can call that self-regulation if you will. Think of the Space Data Association, been there since what, 2012, 2013. Competitors, many companies, meanwhile also NOAA, NASA, EUMETSAT, potentially ESA coming on board to share their ephemeris data, their maneuver plans, and so on. So we need that. That's already a contribution. A subset of countries and so on working together. All of these things will move the needle in the right direction. But what will really help is providing a platform, a global platform for coordination. So that's not enforcement, that's coordination. It has to be voluntary because we don't live at a time when you can make it mandatory, unless regulators, like the space regulator I had lunch with last week, is told to, okay, this is our national policy, we want this to be mandatory. So the mandatory stuff has got to come nationally. UN will not be doing that. I would not be doing that. I mean, companies don't want to see new rules and regulations. They want clarity. They want guidelines, they want best practices, they want standards. So to the extent that we can contribute to that, we'll do it. I'm not going to be pushing for binding stuff. I will ask intelligent questions to regulators like, you agreed on this in the UN setting by consensus. You were very much part of that. So why are you not implementing it? That's an intelligent question and something they should be debating, discussing nationally and acting on. Otherwise, we get criticized for, oh, the guidelines are just paper. They're already from 2019. The world has moved on. That's not the UN's fault. Yeah.
All right. Another question here. Does UNOOSA have any view on efforts like the US-led Artemis Accords to establish best practices for space activities, or the Chinese-led equivalent, the ILRS principles?
Yes, for sure. I've worked very, very hard in establishing good relations with all of the administrations, including the US, the Chinese, the Russian Federation, and so on. And that's a constant work as well. Both Artemis and ILRS are meant to govern the execution of international programs among partner states. And I think that these can be useful to accelerate the creation of standards and best practices by driving consensus among smaller groups of like-minded states. To that extent, I think they can be really useful. And I said we need to be creative in how can we accelerate the work of the committee. Yeah, so I think that those groupings can be useful in that sense. And while the Outer Space Treaty is still the cornerstone of space activities, initiatives like Artemis and ILRS are still a step in the right direction for actionability and more nuances for exploration. And I think we should commend these programs for encouraging the participation of more emerging space nations who, without them, may not have had the chance to be involved. At Space Resources Week in Luxembourg last year, I saw so many presentations from Brazil who are working on aspects of space resources as part of their contribution to the Artemis program. Similarly, at the Chang'e 6 launch in China last year, I spoke with Pakistan and Italy and ESA and Sweden and different countries who had payloads on the Chang'e 6 mission. And would Pakistan have been able to send a payload to the moon to go further in the research and everything that they are doing? I mean, we know that researchers, academics, experts exist in every single country, but they may not all have the capabilities to be involved. And so I think there is a contribution of these kind of initiatives to the fundamental principle of the Outer Space Treaty, which is that space is the province of all mankind. So to a certain extent, they can contribute to that. What we need to avoid is that they become entrenched camps, right, of two geopolitical ideologies. We don't want to see that happening because different ideologies are difficult to marry. We want to see a harmonization if possible, because actually when we engage with all of these member states, they talk to us and they say the same things. They agree with the same principles. It's just that when they convene as ministries of foreign affairs, they are necessarily there with instructions from a political lens that prevent that from coming across. So our hope is that we will see a harmonization of this, and really that each initiative is respected by the other in the future.
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes left here, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of close out here and maybe tell the audience what to expect from UNOOSA, in the coming months, and looking ahead in terms of, recapping some of the activities that you have going on, and some of the topics that you're planning to pursue.
Yeah, so I think I've talked a lot about different initiatives and ideas that we have, but I think one big thing which has come from the Pact for the Future and that heads of state level initiative was, there's this sense of urgency that we need to do something to get a handle on all of these space activities which are running away with themselves. So there has been an invitation or a call to action on COPUS to organize a space summit called Unispace 4. It's called 4 because they've already been 3 before. And this is an event which happens once every 25 years. And these are usually catalytic moments where big initiatives are born, or something significant happens. So, for example, the last Unispace was Unispace 3. That gave birth to the International Committee on GNSS, which is doing all of that valuable cooperation between the satellite navigation systems, which is now looking at establishing lunar time zones and probably much more that I'm not yet that I don't yet have a full understanding of. We also, born of Unispace 3 was our UN Spider program. This is the only program in the world which teaches or helps member states become authorized users of the International Charter for Disasters. The mission of that program is to facilitate access to satellite data for member states who need it, and to train them how they use it. So you can see that significant actions or events could happen at a Unispace. So the committee is trying to align on holding a Unispace 4 in June 2027, probably in Vienna, the home of space diplomacy. And I would encourage, I have already been encouraging the IADC when I spoke at their event last week, the Geneva community when I spoke at an event in Lausanne last week, to really see this as a milestone for the space sector as a whole. Not just can COPUS deliver something, what will COPUS deliver by 2027? As that's when the exam's happening. Will it deliver or will it fail? But really a call to action globally for all of us to try to set ourselves 2027, June 2027, as a useful milestone by which to conclude existing work streams. So those recommendations for principles around space resources that I mentioned, that's an existing work stream. It should culminate by then. ATLAC, this action team for lunar, should also conclude its work by then. So we have some existing work streams. We have new initiatives that we would like to see take off at that time. When I spoke to IADC, I said, you have already inspired COPUS historically. You are a group of 13 space agencies. What can you do to help accelerate some of the work that COPUS needs to do? Yeah, you're already convening 13 established spacefaring nations. And they came back to me and they said, okay, here's 3 initiatives that we're going to try to work on by 2027. I would love to see the space sector as a whole, industry included, start identifying, okay, what do we want to achieve by 2027, so that can be a milestone moment. Right now, we look back to the Outer Space Treaty. Every member state refers to it in COPUS meetings year on year. I've seen that. But we look back on 1967 as the pivotal moment during the Cold War where something really important was born, which is still relevant today. I would hope that 2027, that we will look back on that as the next pivotal moment where XYZ initiatives were born, endorsed, which provided really important cornerstones or pillars or best practices or whatever for the space sector.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Aarti. We are out of time, unfortunately. We appreciate everyone for tuning in and for the great questions that you provided. It's too bad we couldn't get to all of them, but as you can see, Aarti has a small office, but a very big mandate to pursue. So I want to thank all of you for joining us in today's webinar. If you missed any part of this, the full video will be available soon on spacenews.com. Stay tuned for our next webinar coming up in a couple of weeks called Competing with the SpaceX Factor, featuring executives from Eutelsat, Telesat, and Rivada networks, moderated by my colleague, Jason Rainbow. Thanks again for tuning in and have a great day.